This is a picture of me from 8 years ago. I was 11 years old, weighing between 60 and 70 pounds. I liked to listen to my dad's favorite music. I enjoyed reading about Egyptian mythology, and I loved writing about superheroes. I was living a life that I thought was normal for an 11-year-old. Yet my weight would fluctuate often. And a typical morning for 11-year-old me looked like this. On most days, I would wake up feeling sick and quickly rush to the bathroom to throw up. I would then go and eat breakfast like nothing had happened, until, like clockwork, I would get sick again. This could happen a few hours or even a few minutes later. I would either find myself back in the bathroom, leaning over the same porcelain sink, throwing up the same murky brown vial for the second time that morning, or I would find myself back in the bathroom, this time on the icy toilet, experiencing painful cramping and diarrhea, if I could even force my body to have bowel movement. Remember how I said I weighed between 60 and 70 pounds? Most 11-year-olds are supposed to weigh about 80 pounds. Their BMI should fall between the 5th and 85th percentile, according to the CDC, but my BMI fell well below the 5th percentile. I was underweight and malnourished. One doctor even went as far to say that I was dying. I felt like I had no control over my body's health or sickness. It was something that was just happening to me. It's also important to understand that at the time, the doctors I visited regularly had no explanation for why I felt the way I did. I would tell them that I was in pain and getting sick. They would prescribe another drug. Sadly, the medicine they prescribed never worked for me, even as it piled up. And it's important to know that I've been looking for a diagnosis for almost 2 years prior. By the time I was 11, my symptoms had worsened severely. I would get sick anytime I ate. Trying to go anywhere was torture. I dreaded church on Sundays and co-op on Fridays, where I would inevitably get sick in a bathroom I was all too familiar with. Eating out was a nightmare. The smell of food made me nauseous. Meanwhile, the numerous pills the doctors were giving me continued to not help. Soon, my sickness plagued me in the morning, afternoon, and evening as I grew more and more malnourished. Then in 2013, after 3 years of searching, I got a diagnosis. This is 12-year-old me, and this was one of my favorite memories from shortly after my diagnosis. Here I finally felt healthy and confident again. You see, the spotlight had never scared me. I didn't simply have nerves like some doctors believed. No, instead I felt more confident because I was able to walk on that stage without my upset stomach doing somersaults or familiar bile from the sickness rising in my throat. I had gained over 20 pounds in the previous months, and the dress I was wearing had to be sewn 4 times for it to fit me. I ended up winning Junior Grand Champion for Fashion Review at my 4-H fair, which made the journey all the more worth it. It was like a checkpoint in a video game, or maybe it was more similar to a boss battle, where I had defeated the final enemy and, at long last, was handed my trophy for the countless hours I had spent in the game preparing for the fight. The diagnosis was simple, but the road to get there wasn't. I was officially diagnosed with gluten intolerance or gluten sensitivity in the fall of 2013. This was the calendar I had at the time. After I reopened the calendar before this talk, I cried, reminded of all the emotions that this news had carried. Without my mother pushing for my diagnosis, I don't think I would be here today. And no, I don't think I would have suddenly passed away. I was lucky to find a few doctors who fought alongside my mother for a clear diagnosis. No, I don't think I'd be the same healthy, confident individual standing in front of you today. If 11-year-old me knew that I could get up here and share these things with you, she'd be bursting with gratitude. I am so grateful that I can stand in front of you now and bring to light one of the intolerances and an issue that's upsetting our world today. Let's start by asking my favorite question. Do you really have gluten sensitivity? Gluten sensitivity, often referred to as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, to differentiate from celiac disease, is similar to other allergies and intolerances. An individual with GS will find it difficult to eat gluten because it causes them short-term discomfort and symptoms such as stomach pain and headaches. However, just like there have been various names coined for the disease, there are also many different symptoms, and doctors have found that GS can affect people in numerous ways. Bloating, gas, diarrhea, constipation, and abdominal pain are some of the common short-term effects of gluten sensitivity. Short-term simply means that these discomforts will eventually lessen if the person with GS stays away from foods containing gluten or wheat. I've also met people with gluten sensitivity who suffer from brain fog, fatigue, joint pain, nausea, and even various skin problems. These people will often choose to stay away from gluten entirely because it means they will most likely never have to deal with these symptoms again. And then there are people like me, who suffer from a handful of symptoms, such as bloating, constipation, and rashes, so they choose to splurge or eat foods with gluten and wheat occasionally. Everyone is different, which is why it's so hard to diagnose GS, and why a question like, do you really have gluten sensitivity, doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of someone's GS. As I mentioned earlier, when I was looking for a diagnosis for what I was suffering from, I was underweight and malnourished. My symptoms were diarrhea, abdominal pain, and nausea. I threw up after most of the meals I ate and was never voluntary. Alongside these discomforts, I was a female going through puberty. Most doctors wanted to use this as my diagnosis. They wanted to write down that my symptoms were a result of puberty and that I would soon be experiencing periods. But this, of course, didn't help me. My mother, rather than sit back and blindly listen to these doctors, decided to search for a different diagnosis. I remember her yelling at so many doctors, demanding that they run a new test until I felt better. I also remember the nightmares I had at that time, scared of the doctors and their needles that couldn't find a cure. Eventually, I was diagnosed with acid reflux and irritable bowel syndrome. This is when the medicine began being prescribed. The irritable bowel doctor who I visit frequently to go over my bowel movements and what my stool looked like would often give me new medicine based on my current symptoms. I had medicine to help with acid reflux, medicine to help with irritable bowel, medicine to help me with nausea. Nothing helped, however, and I only grew more sick. On top of all of this, I had trouble understanding the irritable bowel doctor. More often than not, I left his office crying, confused, and still in pain. My mother became frustrated again. Our family doctor claimed this new diagnosis was going to work and that we needed to give it time. To him, it was obvious that the symptoms weren't caused by womanly problems, so it had to be something treatable that they could throw medicine at. My mother wouldn't accept this. She demanded that new tests be taken, new blood work be drawn. She did her own research and came to the conclusion that I needed to visit a dietitian. The dietitian took one look at my symptoms and one look at my blood work, which was coming back negative for celiac disease, and said, I think you might have gluten intolerance. Sure enough, after following her instructions and cutting gluten out of my diet, I felt better. My symptoms didn't go away overnight, but their severity did lessen. I began to gain weight almost immediately, and soon malnourishment, acid reflux, and irritable bowel syndrome could all be crossed off of the long list of what I had to take medicine for. I was officially diagnosed with non-celiac gluten sensitivity by the dietitian in 2013. If you want to know why a person really has GS, you should be asking, you have gluten sensitivity? What are your symptoms? Even today, my body has changed a lot. I can eat more gluten and wheat than I could before. If I do eat gluten, I find that my symptoms are either diarrhea or a rash. Sometimes, when I'm out with friends, I'll order a cheeseburger with a bun because I know how much gluten I can eat. When someone asks me this question, I like to share photos. However, I'm not always able to share photos like the one I've already shown you. If I were, though, I think I would share these three to show my progression. This is me 2 years after receiving a diagnosis. This is me 2 years later eating gluten-free donuts. And this is me last year after another 2 years. As you might have been able to guess, I eat all the time now. For me, a diagnosis meant freedom. I still remember visiting amazing places like Brown County and not being able to try the foods I wanted, such as the grits at the Brown County Inn. I'm also not always able to show the statistics. Today, 32 million Americans have allergies and intolerances. Changes in science and medicine have allowed us to recognize these allergies and provide treatment for people who have them. If we look at GS, research estimates that 18 million Americans have gluten sensitivity. That's 6 times the amount of Americans who have celiac disease. A person's blood work may come back negative for celiac disease, like mine did, but they can continue to visit doctors and find other opinions to see if they have gluten sensitivity. My mother demonstrated this well. If she hadn't fought for another diagnosis, I would still be living with irritable bowel and worsening symptoms. Today, I continue to follow her example when it comes to any diagnosis I'm unsure about. I encourage everyone to fight for a cure when they recognize that a current diagnosis isn't working. Following my mother's example, I began doing research on GS when I was 13, shortly after being diagnosed. At that time, studies on gluten sensitivity were limited. I often remember people asking me if GS could be a real disease. This has always been frustrating for me because I experienced malnutrition and pain, and then after a diagnosis, healing and freedom. Today, you can find many different kinds of gluten-free food on shelves. There's more information out there for people so that they can find a diagnosis, one that works. I'm 18 now, and I don't shy away from the questions. I share the facts and the information I've learned over the years, and I continue to share my story. Now, this is what my morning looks like. I wake up, eat a bowl of cereal, or a leftover from the fridge. I'm homeschooled, so I sit down at my desk to do my schoolwork. I no longer find myself running to the bathroom. Instead, I find myself waking up like normal, going to eat lunch like normal, and later eating dinner with my family. I'm grateful that we live in a world that is understanding. There are gluten-free food on shelves and gluten-free meals at fast food restaurants. As GS rises, we need to remind ourselves to be thoughtful and to be respectful if people look for other answers. In an accepting world, we need to accept allergies and the diagnosis moving forward.